Hello students, today in the session of Cost and Works Accounting, I welcome you all for the study of elements of cost. I, Dr.S.R.Pagare from K.J.Somaiya College of Arts, Commerce and Science, Kopargaon, welcome you to the session of elements of cost and cost sheet. In previous lectures, we have studied the concepts of costing, cost accounting, cost accountancy, and also the distinction between cost accounting and financial accounting. We also studied the concept of cost center and cost units and seen the examples of cost centers and cost units. Now in today's lecture we are going to study what are the elements of cost. Basically, cost is made up of three important elements. These three important constituent elements of cost are material, labor and expenses. Material, labor and expenses. So these three are treated as the basic elements of cost. Now, what is the purpose of classification of cost in these various material, labor and expenses? The classification of cost according to the elements is very important for the following basic purposes. The first purpose is to ascertain the relative share and significance of each element of total cost. I repeat, to ascertain the relative share and significance of each element of total cost. Second, to determine the exact cost per unit as well as total cost of the output. Third, to analyze the total cost scientifically. Fourth purpose is to ascertain the cost systematically. There is a difference between scientifically and systematically. And the fifth point is to make use of proper technique for effective planning, absolute control and in-time decision making by the upper level management. By the time we have understood that the upper level management has three important functions to do, and that is effective planning, maintaining absolute control and taking timely decision. So for functioning of all these three, proper classification of cost is necessary. The sixth purpose is to observe carefully the trends in cost behavior. Now the trends in cost behavior, whether the cost increases or decreases for the same product. Seventh one is to determine the accurate product cost, that is the total cost. Next, to value the available cost scientifically and logically. See, the basic term costing means it is a technique and process of ascertaining the cost, and hence to value the available stock. Available stock includes the stock of work in progress, the stock of raw materials and the stock of finished goods. And the last purpose is to understand the various components of total cost. Now let's see each element in detail. First is material. Material is the first important element of cost. The term materials refers to all commodities supplied to the business organization or an undertaking, that is any company. ICMA London defines material cost as the cost of commodities supplied to an undertaking. Basically, material cost is further divided into two parts, direct material and indirect material. Now let's see what does direct material mean. Direct materials are those which can be identified in the product and can be well measured. Direct materials are those which can be identified in the product and can be well measured. They can also be charged to the product directly, and thus direct products enter the product and form a part of finished product. The cost of direct material is known as direct material cost. The cost of direct material is known as direct material cost. Example, leather in shoes, paper in books, timber in furniture, etc. Now let's see what does indirect material mean. The material which cannot be allocated but which can be apportioned to or absorbed by cost centers or cost units is known as indirect material. The material which cannot be allocated but which can be apportioned to or absorbed by cost centers or cost units is known as indirect material. It does not form the part of finished product. The material which cannot be easily identified with individual cost unit is known as indirect material. Example, paper used in polishing furniture, glue in books, thread in garments, etc. Now let's see the distinction between direct and indirect material. Direct material is that material which can be easily identified with and allocated to cost units, whereas indirect material is that material which cannot be easily identified with individual cost units. Direct material generally becomes a part of the finished product, whereas indirect material does not become a part of finished product. Direct material directly enters the product and forms a part of finished product, whereas indirect material relates to the factory overheads. Now let's look at the second important element of cost, and that is labor. Who is labor? Labor is an individual human being engaged in manufacturing and non-manufacturing activities of a product. The cost incurred on labor is termed as labor cost. Labor cost is defined as the cost of remuneration. Remuneration includes wages, salaries, commission, bonus, etc. So labor cost is defined as the cost of remuneration of the employees of a business organization or an undertaking. Now this labor cost is also further divided into two parts, that is direct labor and indirect labor. What is direct labor? All the workers who are directly engaged in the manufacturing activity are known as direct laborers. They are also known as direct workers. The remuneration paid to direct laborers is known as direct labor cost. This cost is easily identified with a particular product, process or unit. Now let's see the examples of direct labor. Wages paid to shoemaker, charges paid to tailor, and ticket taken from bus conductors, etc. are the examples of direct labor. Now indirect labor. The labor that is of general character and cannot be easily identified with a particular cost unit is known as indirect labor. I repeat, the labor that is of general character and cannot be easily identified with a particular cost unit is known as indirect material. The wages which cannot be allocated but which can be apportioned or absorbed by cost centers or cost unit is known as indirect labor cost. Let's see the distinction between direct and indirect labor. Direct labor consists of wages paid to workers directly engaged in converting raw material into finished products, whereas indirect labor is not directly engaged in production operations, but they only assist or help in production operations. Direct labor wages are easily identified with a particular product, job or process, whereas indirect labor is not easily identifiable. Direct labor, all laborers are engaged in altering the construction, composition of the product, and that is known as direct labor. In indirect labor, the wages which cannot be allocated but which can be apportioned to or absorbed by cost centers or cost unit is known as indirect labor. Now let's look at the third important element, that is expenses. All costs other than material and labor is termed as expenses. All costs other than material and labor is termed as expenses. It is defined as the cost of services provided to an undertaking and the notional cost of the use of owned assets. These expenses are further divided into two parts, direct expenses and indirect expenses. Let's see direct expenses. Expenses which can be easily identified with and allocated to cost centers and cost units are known as direct expenses. Expenses which are easily identified and which can be allocated to cost centers and cost units are known as direct expenses. Direct expenses are also known as chargeable expenses because they get easily charged to a particular cost center or a cost unit. Direct expenses form a part of prime cost. Let's see what are the examples of direct expenses. Hiring of special plant, royalties, engineers' fees, productive expenses, process expenses, cost of special drawings, designs, layouts, etc. This is direct expenses example. Now let's see what are indirect expenses. All indirect costs other than indirect material and indirect labor are termed as indirect expenses. All indirect costs other than indirect material and indirect labor are termed as indirect expenses. These expenses are not charged directly to any production house. Example, rents, rates and taxes, staff welfare expenses, insurance, bank charges, etc. Let's have a look at distinction between direct and indirect expenses. Direct expenses are easily identified with and allocated to cost centers and cost units, whereas indirect expenses other than indirect material and indirect labor are known as indirect expenses. Direct expenses are also known as chargeable expenses whereas indirect expenses are known as non-chargeable expenses. Direct expenses form a part of prime cost, whereas indirect expenses form a part of overheads. In further lecture, we will be coming across two important terms known as prime cost and overheads. So what is prime cost? Let us have a look at the definition. The aggregate or total of direct material cost, direct labor cost and direct expenses is termed as prime cost. That means the total of all direct elements of cost is a prime cost. Whereas what is overheads? The aggregate or total of indirect material cost, indirect labor cost and indirect expenses is termed as overheads. That is, all indirect elements of cost are known as overheads. I hope you have got the idea of elements of cost. In next lecture, we shall be seeing at the prime cost and the overheads. Till then, enjoy learning. Thank you.